Good morning, and I would like first of all to thank the organizers, the KLI and KDI, and the Korean government for organizing this event and for inviting the ILO to it, because I think the topic is very interesting. It's also a very refreshing topic at a time when many countries are struggling to maintain employment rates at 60%. Korea is already trying to achieve an employment rate of 70%. So I think this is a very interesting and important event indeed. In the presentation, I would like to follow up on, I think, the presentation of Ambassador Lee, who discussed the issue of inequalities and how inequalities somehow are related to economic growth. And here, in the presentation, I'd like to, in a way, to give an illustration of this and emphasize the importance of promoting job quality, this as a way to promote employment performance. Very often, the issues of social protection, issues of labor market regulation are seen a little bit as a contradiction to employment goals. And in the presentation, I'd like to say how, through good design, it is possible to combine both good quality jobs and actually good employment performance. Starting with a brief overview of the cross-country job patterns, I will be very brief because Jean-Louis already mentioned this. We are talking about a situation where only very few countries, the countries on the right-hand side of the chart, have achieved employment rates which are above pre-crisis, pre-financial crisis levels. So a situation where still countries are struggling. Korea is one of those privileged countries that have achieved high employment rates than pre-crisis, but the vast majority are below. But here I would like to emphasize a few countries which have achieved more than 70% employment rates and focus on their characteristics. What is it that they have, these countries, and how have they achieved that employment rate of more than 70%? First of all, an overview of the different conditions in the countries. If you compare weak employment performance, that is to say, countries where employment rates are really low, with average performance and strong performance, you see that the links between performance on the one hand and the policy settings on the other are not at all as simple as it are sometimes described. You see that in countries that actually do relatively well, social protection as a percent of GDP is also relatively high. There's a lot of variation here, but it's an average. And also is the case that active labor market policies are clearly higher. There's more emphasis on active market policies. And regulations, at least in terms of synthetic index of regulation, of labor market regulation, they're also characterized by relatively demanding labor market regulation. And still, again, let me repeat, they do relatively well, and their unemployment increased less than was the case in weaker or average performance. Let's narrow the focus even more and look at a few countries. And these are countries that are relatively well placed. You see Korea has employment rate of around 65%. And then you have the countries I mentioned before, countries that have more than 70% employment rates, from Australia to Austria, Canada, Germany, Japan, Netherlands, Sweden. The US has employment rate of less than 70%. It was around 70% before the crisis, but it's also lower than the employment rates of the other countries in the same table. So these are countries which, for those that have already more than 70% employment rates, have social protection spending as a percent of GDP, which is slightly higher than average, and also employment regulations on permanent workers or regular workers, as is the terminology here in Korea, which is relatively strong or close to the average. And for example, Austria or the Netherlands, which are two countries where good design is particularly sophisticated and particularly effective, you see has an index of employment protection legislation for regular workers, which is very close to that of Korea. So that is very interesting. So what is meant by good design? Because if you see this performance, it means that design matters a lot. You have countries that spend about the same as the good performance, and they do worse. you have countries that have regulations about the same as Korea, but they do worse. So what is good design? The first is, in terms, I'll start with social protection and I'll move to regulations, that it's very important, and again, it reminds the points mentioned before by Ambassador Lee, that social protection plays a role as automatic stabilizer in the face of crisis. And I think one of the key lessons, if you ask me, what would be the main good lesson or good policy which we could isolate from in terms of responding to the financial crisis, I would say job sharing arrangements, like, for example, the Kurzarbeit in Germany, but this exists in other countries like Canada, Brazil, Italy. I would mention also Argentina for that matter. So there has been an attempt to retain jobs in enterprises which otherwise were viable, and therefore it reduced the need to lay off workers. So a very important tool for job retention, a very important tool to avoid significant increases in unemployment. And this is particularly important because it actually means that even though there's a bit more spending now, more government spending now, it may reduce the need for government spending and deficits in the future. So that's a first benefit, provided again that social protection is well designed. This is not easy to do, but these countries have managed to do it. Another role, very important role of social protection, is a more structural role, which is to support productive labor market participation. In the sense that for certain groups, like it was mentioned, women, like also older workers, like those people who have low skilled and are unemployed, it's very important that social protection plays a role in reactivating them, in helping them obtain new employment, obtain new skills, and therefore remain in the labor market. So this is another very important, in this case, more structural role of social protection. And I think even more profound effect of social protection in this sense is to reassure the weakest segments of the labor market that there is some alternative to them, some re-employment alternative, and therefore they may be in a better position to bargain, in a way, wages and working conditions, which is a trend decline in the labor share in GDP, and this could contribute to, at least to some extent, arrest it. The question is often put, okay, this is interesting, but what about the impact on the deficit? So as part of the G20 process, we have developed a specific model, macroeconomic model, where we put together macroeconomic variables with labor market policies. And we find that interventions which are well designed, let me emphasize again, but which provide this kind of social protection and avoid a significant decline in the labor share in GDP, would of course facilitate employment adjustments. And here you see the dashed line has, which is the continuation of status quo policies, is a simulation only for European countries, has more employment than a job-friendly macroeconomic setting with this kind of social protection. This is obvious in a way, but what is interesting is that this job-friendly macroeconomic approach is also more positive through time in terms of public debt and deficits. And you see actually a vivid illustration in Europe where the countries that have pushed further in terms of aggressive labor market reforms and very significant cuts in spending actually do not manage to reduce public deficits very much. That's a very interesting illustration of this point. It's just a theoretical model in a way. It is illustrated in practice. Let's move from social protection to the question, which is more complex, in fact, of labor market regulation. And here, obviously, the challenge is to facilitate recruitment of stable contracts, but also avoid excessive insecurity of workers, which actually is one of the fundamental reasons why there is a decline in the labor share in many countries. And of course, recruitment with stable contracts is difficult if barriers to layoff are too high, and that is a reality. But unstable employment arrangements are also bad for employment, and in particular, employment of underrepresented groups. Those who have to enter the labor market are disproportionately affected if employment conditions are unstable, because they are often trapped in low-quality jobs, unstable jobs, and they have to rotate jobs all the time. So what have we learned from evidence? And I'm sorry not to express a personal opinion, I'm just talking only exclusively about evidence, is that improving the legal security of regulation is of paramount importance. In every country, even in New Zealand, for example, where employment regulations are very lax and very light, enterprises always complain that severance pay is too high. It's a fact of life. In a way, they are always right. But where they have a point, enterprises, is in pointing when regulations are unpredictable. When, in the case of layoff, they don't know actually how much they have to pay. When the process of layoff is too long or suffers variable delays. That is an issue. And I think there is a discussion here in Korea, for example, about the question of dismissal for managerial reasons. What does it mean? What is the legal security of this concept? So improving the legal security of regulations, as has been done in Austria and the Netherlands, where compensation for layoff is more than in Korea, but actually enterprises know for sure how much they have to pay in case of layoff and how long it takes to process a layoff. The other way to approach this is from the point of view of workers themselves, is to improve the legal security for workers, and in this sense, improve the protection of non-regular employment is also extremely important. Examples of Canada, recently Italy, also Korea has done a reform in 2007, going in this direction, improving the protection of non-regular employment as well, is a way to secure the labor market. And finally, facilitating part-time employment. I think Jean-Louis Schneider mentioned that, it's very true. I think Australia, but there will be today, I understand, a presentation of Australia, I would say very little, is a country which has done that successfully. In last year's World of Work report, we did a kind of quantitative analysis of the links between employment protection legislation and employment performance, and we found that whereas the standard, the assumed link is one of a negative relationship, in other words, the more the legislation, the less the employment rate, which is the negative line here. The evidence, the data tell us that the relationship is more complex. It's an inverse U, if you wish, with actually regulations supporting employment through the mechanisms I mentioned before, up to a certain point, and beyond a certain threshold of regulation, empirically, we see a negative relationship between the two. So a bit more complex, and again, the design playing a very important role. Regulations are also important from the point of view of working time. It's not just dismissal, and here it has been said already that in Korea working hours are very long, and this has also, to some extent, an effect on the participation rate of certain groups, women, for example, young people who want to combine study and work, for example, or older workers who want to have a more gradual retirement, three very important underrepresented groups. Very long working hours, of course, represent a challenge, of course, to participate in the labor market under this condition. It's not just only the labor market. There has been perhaps an excessive focus on labor market regulations or labor market reforms in order to address labor market problems. Sometimes, and in some countries very much, the product market or the financial market is an even more important determinant of employment performance than labor market policies themselves. This is just an illustration with the credit system for European countries, which is suffering very much from this at the moment. There is a phased relationship between availability of credit to the real economy, especially small enterprises in 1 year, and increases in unemployment the year after. So in other words, the credit crunch is an important predictor of increases in unemployment later on. And this is an issue which was a little neglected in the early stages of the crisis. There is much more discussion now in Europe about that. I'm mentioning this because only to say that it's not just labor market policy. You can do a lot on labor market policy, but if the credit system doesn't function, then it will have very little effect. Another point is the issue of, I think it's also very, very important and a bit neglected, the issue of economic inequalities. There has been a lot of discussion about income inequality, social inequality is very important, but also what seems to be growing is economic inequalities. We have done an analysis with millions of enterprises based on a world data set, looking at the accounts and the profitability and the income conditions of enterprises by size. And we find a regularity, this is just an illustration for Korea, but it's more general, that the profitability of small enterprises is more and more lagging behind the profitability of larger enterprises. And this is controlling for lots of things like sector and so on. And this may suggest here problems of insufficiency of the product market regulations vis-à-vis large enterprises, issues of monopoly power and so on, and small enterprises being at the end of the value-added chain and being in a very difficult position to provide stable contracts. So again, a link with employment, both in quantitative terms and in qualitative terms, coming in this case from product markets. A third issue, besides social protection and employment regulations, which I would like to emphasize, is the issue of underrepresented groups, and it's very clear that, for example, in the case of Korea, bringing the employment rate to 70% would imply a lot of emphasis on women, young people, less on older workers. Actually, they participate more than in other countries in the labor market. Again, let me emphasize that the main policy thrust has to be a general policy, which is why the approach reminded before by Deputy Minister Lee, which is to have a broad labor market policy, is the right one, because these countries are underrepresented for reasons which are systemic, not necessarily for reasons which are specific to the group. Nevertheless, there are some policies specific to the groups which are important. Let me remind three, which are particularly complex. The first one is regarding the school-to-work transition. Everybody wants easier, faster school-to-work transition. But actually, one of the main difficulties is a systemic difficulty, which is the difficulties of establishing links between the education system and the labor market in a number of countries. Not everywhere. There are 4 countries that do very well, for example, which are Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Austria, where the links are very good. And actually, these are the only 4 countries, to my knowledge, in the world where the youth unemployment rates are very close to the average unemployment rate, very close. And it's because there's a very strong interconnection between the school system and the labor market. And so achieving that is very complex, but certainly it's a precondition for this to succeed, to bring to a faster integration of young people and a higher employment rates for youth. In terms of gender, there has to be, of course, gender balance in terms of employment, but also gender balance in childcare. It's not just a question of childcare facilities, which in a way implicit in this is that it's women who should take care of children, therefore you need childcare facilities. It's also gender balance in childcare itself, of course, very important, and providing more options for childcare facilities. Also greater and more participation of women in the management boards of enterprises is important on its own, but also for changing practices within enterprises. The culture of long working hours in some countries, the issues, the abrupt career breaks that happen in enterprises, these are issues which are very much in the realm of the enterprises themselves. And some countries have started to put targets there as well, not just in terms of employment rates, but in terms of the participation of women in the boards of enterprises. It's just an idea. I don't know what Professor Sukong Kim, who is an expert on these issues, would think about that, but it's certainly an idea for improving the situation concretely on the workplace. For all the workers, a lot has been done in many countries, also in Korea, about the pension system. There's a lot of discussion about retirement allowances in Korea. Has to do with the question of severance pay and what I mentioned before about labor market regulations. Something has been done. But one area where it's particularly difficult to do anything, which is that the practice of mandatory retirement in the enterprise. You can reform many things through legislation, through pension reform and so on, but if in enterprises, in organizations, there's a mandatory retirement age, then that actually, in a way, mandates and early exit from all the workers, or abrupt interruptions of career from all the workers. How to tackle mandatory retirement will be a big challenge in many countries. Let me finally, Professor, finish with some remarks or some reflections on Korea, and from the evidence, from the international evidence. I think it's fair to say that Korea is probably at crossroads in terms of employment policy. Korea has probably managed to, when we're looking in perspective, I worked in this country since 1997. I think the achievements are remarkable. Korea managed to overcome the Asian financial crisis much faster than most other Asian countries. It did so through a combination of policies involving limited social protection, a focus on labor market reform to address employment problems, but it's interesting that many of the reforms were undertaken by the Tripartite Commission and agreed therefore in a tripartite context. A leading role of large enterprises has been very important for Korea as a driver of economic growth and development, and education as a goal in and of itself. I think these are pillars, or have been pillars, of Korea and have served Korea very well until now. It has managed to, of course, achieve high economic growth and improve the employment rate up to where it is now, which is around 65%. But clearly, to go beyond that, to move to 70%, which is the new target for the government, will require a shift, probably a gradual shift. There is never, nothing is ever radical in this area, a shift to a new approach. To start with, because there is a big demographic change, in part due to the labor market policy settings themselves. Because with the present labor market policies and a situation, especially of women in the labor market, it's difficult for women to engage in more taking care of children and so on, because, of course, it's a big risk to their career. So it has an impact, but demographics in and of itself creates a different setting for Korea. Also, growth will have to rely much more from now on productivity advancements. I think that's clear also from earlier presentations, and tackling rampant income inequalities, and also, I would add, economic inequalities between large and small firms. So there's a new context here for labor market policy. And so a new approach, and I venture here at my own risk, some elements of possible elements of a new approach, which could include the following. The first, a careful expansion of social protection, which of course will imply a bit of a higher cost, but higher rewards as well, because childcare facilities, the coverage of non-regular workers, it was reminded before by Jean-Louis Schneider before, it implies a certain cost, but it's very important for securing a more inclusive labor market, less inequality, but also higher productivity. The second is more diversity in regular employment paths. Until now, the regular path was almost unique, but maybe more diversity, provide more security, perhaps create a regular part-time employment path, different types of work arrangements, but more regularized, could be an idea in order to, and necessary in fact, to increase the employment rate, because for certain groups it will not be possible to participate as much as would be needed unless more diversity in regular employment paths is available. And here it's a caution against labor market reforms that focus exclusively on just reducing severance pay on regular workers and not reflecting more broadly on the different policy options, in fact. The third is, where will productivity growth come? Probably from now on from small firms, and from where the gap seems to be in Korea now, which is small firms becoming medium-sized firms. This is where many jobs will come and many productivity gains will come. And again, it's a question of not just focusing on labor market reforms, but broader reforms of the financial system, perhaps the ideas for the green growth, which were mentioned before by the Deputy Minister, could be a solution here. And finally, I think a new partnership between the education system, enterprises, and families is probably necessary in order to improve the school-to-work transition. And I would say if the education system could have more responsibility in the placement of young people who have studied, what happens to them in the labor market, maybe it would facilitate a reorientation of the study, a combination of education and practical experience. I'm now living in Switzerland for the past 5 years, Mr. Chair, a country that you know also very well, I know. It's very difficult in the country where I live now to find a professional, an engineer, a dentist, whatever the profession, an economist, who does not have next to him or to her a trainee, somebody who is actually studying, who is having a first experience. Very difficult to find them without a trainee next to them. I think this is a very good practice, Mr. Chair, because it's a way to provide a first experience to young people, and it's a way also for education authorities to be responsible for providing and facilitating these first experiences. I think this could be instrumental in reaching the target of 70%. Thank you very much.